Welcome to Heart of a Shepherd. We are continuing our study in the book of Psalms. Our chapter reading today, Psalm 55. Now, this will be the first of two video devotionals for today. Now, the title of our study, Managing Betrayal, Fear, Flight, Frustration, and Faith. As we study this, you're going to understand why those four words are in our title. Well, the event that inspired Psalm 55 is not recorded. However, I believe it was closely related to the time when Absalom, David's son, led an insurrection against his father. Now, you might remember a man by the name of Ahithophel. He was the father of Bathsheba, David's father-in-law. He had been a trusted advisor of David, and yet he had joined Absalom as a co-conspirator in the rebellion. So I believe that's the context of what we're studying here today. Now, after crying out to the Lord to hear his prayer, you'll notice that David expressed his sorrow that his enemies had mocked him and, quote, the terrors of death were fallen upon him. Now that's recorded in verses 1 through 4. Now, David's despair and response to the betrayal, you'll notice, are reflected in Psalm 55. We'll begin with the word fear. Psalm 55, verse 4 and 5. Now, here we read, David's initial response to betrayal was fear, accompanied by the brooding that usually comes with fear. David writes in verse 4, my heart, literally my mind, my thoughts, my heart is sore pained within me. Literally, he's saying my heart is trembling, and the terrors of death are fallen upon me. In verse 5, fearfulness or terror and trembling are come upon me, and horror hath overwhelmed me. Now, on a side note, when I read that, I'm reminded this is the slayer of the giant Goliath. This is the great general, the great soldier of Israel, the great king of Israel. And now we find that he is literally terrified. Now in verse 6 through 8, we have the record of David's second response after fear was flight. Now you'll notice that is again part of the process of the betrayal. David indicates in verses 6 through 8, if he could, he would have retreated and found a hiding place far from his troubles. And then verse 6 through 8, we read, and I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then would I fly away and be at rest, that is, find a place of shelter. Lo, then would I wander far off and remain in the wilderness. I would, in verse 8, hasten my escape from the windy storm and tempest. You ever felt like that? Not only fear, but a desire to fly, to just, as David says, to fly away. And that brings us to the third reaction or response to David's enemies rising up against him. And the word is frustration. Notice in verse 12 through 14 that we find other words that can describe this king's emotional state. Besides the fear and the flight, the thought of despair, disbelief, and even dismay. David writes in verse 12, for it was not an enemy that reproached me, then I could have borne it. In other words, I would have expected an enemy to treat me like this. And then he goes on and he writes, neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me, then I would have hid myself from him. But then David writes, it was thou, a man mine equal, my guide and mine acquaintance. That's why I think it was Ahithophel that is the object of this Psalm 55. And David continues, we took sweet counsel together and walked unto the house of God in company, or together. And so David is bewildered that the man that he trusted, the man that was his counselor, the man that he had looked to as his peer, The man that really, if it was Ahithophel, was his elder. And yet now he finds that that man has betrayed him. In verse 20 and 21, we read, "He hath put forth his hand against such as be at peace with him." He has broken his covenant, whatever covenant that might have been that he had with David. That enemy had broken that covenant. And we read in verse 21 that the words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, and yet were they drawn swords. Wow, what a betrayal David is describing. So here we now have fear, flight, frustration. They are all natural reactions to betrayal and trouble. And we fear those consequences. If you've ever been in a position where you've had people to betray you, you want to escape the pain and create as much distance as possible between you and those who hurt you. And when physical escape isn't possible, you may be tempted to withdraw into depression and nurse your wounds. You see, David was king. And even if he stepped down from his throne for a while, he couldn't escape the duty that came with being God's anointed. The problems he faced were God-sized problems that only the Lord could resolve. That brings us to verses 16 through 18 and verse 22. And the fourth word in our study is the word faith. David shifted his focus in verses 16 through 18 from his hurts and disappointments, and he prayed. Notice with me verse 16. David writes, "As for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. Evening and morning and at noon will I pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. He, the Lord, hath delivered my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for there were many," David writes, "with me." Now, I don't know any leader who hasn't faced betrayal and experienced the reactions and emotions that David describes in Psalm 55. Fear, fleeing, frustration, those are all natural responses. However, faith remains the only sure place where a believer can rest and find refuge. I conclude with David's invitation that's recorded in verse 22. And surely it's an invitation to everyone who has suffered betrayal and carries the scars of disappointment. We read, "Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. He shall never suffer the righteous to be moved." What an incredible promise. Let me read that again. "Cast thy burden upon the Lord. He shall sustain you. He will lift you up. He will encourage you. And he shall never suffer or allow the righteous to be moved." Oh yeah, fear, frustration, flight, those are all natural responses until we cast our fears, our concerns, our anxieties on the Lord, and then trust he will sustain us. Well, my friend, thank you for being a part of this study. And this has been the second video devotional for today. God bless and bye-bye.